All right, this week we're talking about Temperance. Ooh. So I've talked about other cards in the deck that I struggled with when I was learning, and that I had a hard time making sense of, and that just didn't sort of click for me. I always sort of knew what Temperance meant, even if I don't necessarily have a mainstream understanding of it today. It really was easy for me to parse, even though the image itself never really made a whole lot of sense, but I'll get to that in a little bit. I've heard Temperance sometimes interpreted as balance, but I think there are so many cards in the deck that kind of speak to that. We don't really need another one. There's Justice, and there's the Two of Cups, and the Two of Pentacles, and the Two of Swords, and really all the sixes, and so I don't know. It's just not an association for the card that feels necessary to me, but it makes sense to me that we would want a lot of cards in the deck that suggest balance because I feel like life is so imbalanced. You may have noticed a complete and total lack of talk about alchemy in this series, and you will not hear anything about it other than this mention in this card, even though it's a card that has a lot of alchemical associations to people. I think they make sense if you study that stuff, but I don't study that stuff, and I don't find it useful in readings, so again, it's just not going to come up. But if there's a card that would speak to that sort of system. Is it a system? I don't even know. So like, I'm not even that interested in it enough to know what you would really call it. Anyway, it's not for me, and so that's that. This is a card that for me always suggested moderation, which has always made it kind of a boring card for me because I am immoderate in all ways. Excess is my albatross, and also a vice that delights me. But I think back to when I was a kid and I would sort of say, oh, this isn't healthy, or like I should eat less. My mother would always say everything in moderation. The point being, like, if you want pizza, have pizza, don't have the whole pizza. But you can see me, like, that's not an easy topic for me to sort of bring to life in my life. Still good advice, though. Moderation, solution to a lot of things. Not politics, but a lot of other things. So if the question is, how do I resolve this conflict, the Temperance card might suggest going into the meeting without your guns blazing, but also not being a pushover. Be moderate. Be balanced? Did I just use the word balanced after my little tirade about balance? Take that, me. I often see this card come up in readings for people who are in a new relationship. Temperance will come in to sort of remind us not to go all in, but also not to put all our blocks up, all our guards up, that we can go in moderately. We can have a moderate, temperate path forward into a relationship, which again is not something I've ever been good at, by the way. So again, it's advice that I'm good at giving, but not necessarily good at taking. Whatever, I regret nothing. Non, je ne regrette rien. New relationships can sort of go from 0 to 60, and sometimes they burn out before they have potential to gain traction because they're sort of all hot and heavy all the time, and they just sort of run out of fuel. Which is fine in some cases. Some cases a fling is fine. But sometimes relationships could be sustained with moderation by sort of going in with more realistic expectations, a little bit of self-control, which is very hard to do when you're like really attracted to someone and you're in that first phase of, oh my God, I love this person. But sometimes it can sustain a relationship. And then sometimes the relationship's just a dumpster fire and it was never meant to be anyway. But tarot could tell us that too. One of the reasons why this card is sometimes kind of boring to me is that when you pair it with slower cards, like, I don't know, the Empress, the Star even, the Moon maybe, it could be a sign that you need to rev things up, that you're being too moderate, that you're being kind of a stick in the mud. There is a little bit of conservatism to this card, where sometimes you really need to like go full speed ahead in order to get something done. Temperance takes its time, and it can maybe get stuck in a rut that way. Even if you see it with like the Wheel of Fortune in some contexts, right? Like you could be stuck in a loop. Ultimately, like too much of anything is a bad thing, even moderation. So like if you're too moderate for too long in some situations, you could just be holding yourself up. Because everything is its double, the card could also suggest being immoderate, which like I just said is sometimes a good thing. Like we need to kick it into gear. Sometimes, though, like it could be the cause of a conflict. If you're doing a reading about a conflict, it might be that you are being immoderate and you need to moderate your approach. You need to temper your approach in order to resolve things. You need to moderate yourself. This is an interesting card, and I'm going to get into some discussion about substance abuse in a sec, just very gently, but I want to sort of mention that. But this is a card that can have a relationship to alcohol or entertainment, and I'll explain that before I get into the substance abuse piece. The thing about this card is that it could easily represent bartenders, servers, sort of anyone in the service industry or hospitality, for example. Just, image-wise, those sort of cups. That's especially true if you're pairing it with a lot of cups cards, or even coins cards, which you could think of as plates. So, you could have like the Page of Cups with Temperance representing a waiter, for example. I wrestled with whether or not to include this because what I don't want to encourage is people who are not trained clinicians going out and diagnosing someone. I think it's really a tricky thing to do to talk about substance abuse in a tarot reading unless you're qualified to do it, which I am not. But I do think that it can be helpful in some cases if we're trying to understand our past, or a client is trying to understand a past difficult relationship. If Temperance shows up paired with Cups cards, particularly the Nine of Cups, it could suggest an issue with drug and alcohol abuse or something similar. And the reason that that could be valuable for you as a reader or for a client is to understand that you were not the reason the relationship failed, that the person was struggling with a disease that they had not learned they had or understood or healed from. And so I think when we're looking into readings about our past, like why was this bad relationship so bad? Why was my relationship with this relative so bad? Certain card combinations that include temperance could suggest that there was intemperance when it comes to substances. So I really would caution against like jumping to that, but I think it can be helpful. And if you are a clinician or if you do have counseling licensure or experience, then that could be something that becomes part of the puzzle in some instances too. I just think that the reason I wouldn't go into a reading and say, oh, I think you might have a problem like this, is because when it comes to things like addiction, if people aren't ready to hear it, it can actually push them further back from their progress. So we have to be really thoughtful as practitioners who are not nurses, who are not counselors, therapists, etc., to walk a tightrope and not really push something that we're not qualified to do. But when we're looking backwards at a relationship that didn't work, that could be interesting information. So I put it out there for your consideration, I guess. But just to bring it back, on the other side, it really could suggest celebrations, the need for a celebration, a toast, a wedding toast. Like if you do, is so-and-so going to ask me to be in their wedding party? The Temperance card could suggest, yeah, you're going to be giving the toast, for example. I mean, that's awfully specific, but you get what I mean. This is a very wet card. It's very moist. Yeah, I said it. So it could represent weather. It could represent storms or floods, when you pair it with watery cards. Again, like, when are you gonna like do weather readings? But again, you're like, oh, what's if we have this wedding outside, what's it gonna be like? Temperance and like the tower could suggest there's gonna be a thunderstorm. In the United States, temperance was a political movement, and so you could sort of work that into a reading too, where temperance becomes representative of a movement of any kind, a political movement, of course. So, if you're engaged in a cause, temperance could signify that cause. It's a movement. I feel like there should be a Hamilton quote here, but I'm not really all that interested in. I feel like Disney would be really litigious. Temperance was an interesting movement, though. It's very nuanced, it's very complicated, and because I can't go a week without mentioning the fucked up history of this land, I'm going to do that now. This is probably where everyone clicks off, but it's actually really interesting. Temperance was an interesting movement because on one hand, it worked. The temperance activists got the movement to become a law that banned alcohol. So they got what they wanted. But the consequence of that, the direct consequence of that movement, was far larger than I think anyone anticipated. What did I even write? Actions have consequences, as I always say, and the consequence of temperance was that taking away a vice that people were going to get anyway actually created more crime. The reason that organized crime became so big in so many American cities was because of bootlegging alcohol. The reality is that people were going to get their booze one way or another, and if they couldn't get it legally, they were going to get it illegally. So it actually created a whole new criminal system in the country that really wasn't that active before. Proponents of the law would have told you that it was meant to decrease crime, but it did the opposite. The crime that was already there didn't drop, and it created a whole new kind of crime on the menu that wasn't there to begin with. So the law actually failed. The law made everyone into criminals, because the wealthy were never not going to have their wine at their dinner parties. They got it one way or another, and then everyone else had to get their booze illegally. So instead of decreasing crime, it just made everyone into a sort of private bootlegger. Woven into the whole temperance movement is, of course, our long history in this country of racism and classism. because the people who were temperance activists were operating from a wealthy white perspective that the problems in the world were caused by poverty and race, and those were made worse by drinking. Now, this is, of course, because wealthy white people always get to define what was criminal and what wasn't. But this was a law that was directly designed to to attack poor people and non-white people. And I say non-white people instead of people of color because of that time, non-white would also have included like Italian and Irish immigrants. Wealthy people were always going to do what wealthy people were going to do because they always do. They get away with whatever they want. They were still having wine when they wanted it. So the law was really about this perception that poor people and immigrants were gross criminals, which you certainly do not hear in modern political rhetoric at all, right? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and I don't want to get into the whole like white feminism conversation, but temperance was primarily called the women's movement. It was tied into the Equal Rights Voting Act, which always centered white women at the expense of black, brown, and immigrant women, and wealthy women over poor women. In a way, you could kind of call the temperance movement like the progenitor of the Karens of today. Carrie Nation, who was one of the major activists in the country, would go into bars and smash them with an axe, totally destroy property, and get away with it, because she was a white lady. So the power of whiteness was always being used in this country, including the temperance movement, which was so unsuccessful and created so much crime that it eventually went away. So when I said that this card can represent political movements, it gave me an excuse to talk about politics, which you know I love doing, and I know many of you hate. But there is something to be said for movements that they're not all one thing. Like, even if a movement is positive, there are parts of it that may need to be looked at, that may need to be explored, and that may just simply be unjust, biased, etc. And so it's also an opportunity when we're part of a movement to say, what am I really part of? And what is it really doing? What are the consequences of this action? Not to say that you shouldn't be part of it, but that maybe there are things that need to be course corrected, clarified, and considered down the line. If X happens, what will Y be? And what are unintended consequences that we could have? So temperance could have all this layers to it, is my point, and it gives me an excuse to talk about history and classism. So there you go. And I guess one thing I'll say about the temperance movement that I kind of think is so ironic and brings me back to the beginning of this card is that the temperance movement was by nature completely intemperate. A moderate reaction to crime would be to say, well, let's limit alcohol sales, or let's ban certain kinds of alcohol. It didn't do that. It was completely fundamentalist. All alcohol is bad, it's gone, you can't buy it. So in being temperate, in calling it the temperance movement, is a little crafty, political maneuver there to say, oh, it's temperance, it's all about moderation and balance. No, it's about control, which is what so many American political movements are. But boy, anyway, that's temperance. So lots to think about with this card. And I said it was boring. Who knew, right? This video, for some reason, has been really hard for me to record. Like, I have not been able to focus. Anyway, that's what I have to say about Temperance. I think it's a really fascinating card once you sort of pull it apart and look into all its sort of, I was going to say nooks and crannies, but I hate that expression. It sounds weird, but you get what I mean. So we're coming up on, like, the rest of the deck. Like, I'm like, let's go. Maybe I should, like, record all the videos at once and just save myself the time, but whatever. I hope you're having a good week. I hope you're staying healthy. Be good. We'll talk soon. Take care.